So as you can see, this was going to be a fun session. So even though I mostly agree with both of these guys, I'm going to on purpose just be tongue-in-cheek and kind of make fun of them. So I think there's nothing more fun than making fun of your colleague in public. So let me first start with a question for both of you, and then I'm going to jump into the specifics of what you said. I'll try to figure out how to bring in a mosquito into my conversation as well. So I guess one of the things I feel like both of you guys are saying, and I wanted to kind of comment on that a bit and then have you respond to it, which is it's a bit of a very native first kind of view of, look, let us just be what we're going to be. There's no external actor. We don't need external knowledge. We don't need best practices. We don't need anyone coming from outside. Outside people are always damaging for us. That seems like a pretty naive view to me. Take something like Venezuela. Ricardo is sitting over here. Would you advocate that view over there? Is there ever any role for an external actor to come in to either share knowledge or to share experience or to share benchmarks? Your view, provocative as it is, suggests no. Adnan?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying two things. So one is on the big question of getting a state unstuck in a political economy sense. The autonomy and the agency of the countries that are themselves responsible for it, we have to respect that. So no country in the world has developed based on the visions of outside actors, even though they may be benevolent. So every country has to do it, and its political actors have to do it themselves. The second thing that I'm saying is, yes, outside actors have a big role to play if they empower, facilitate, bring new ideas from outside. And that's not necessarily outside the country. It could also be within the country. Most of my life I used to work in the government, and one key feature of working in the government was almost every day you were in a world of firefighting, sometimes actual fires also. But then when you are in that world, you always think that you don't have time to think about these things, and that's not your maybe comparative advantage. You wish someone else had thought about these issues. And there, again, even within a country, you definitely need to have people, call it the inside-outside perspective, people from outside who have different comparative advantages and strengths and skills, analysts, researchers, not of the type that Lant is talking about, but people who can work with you from outside, even whether within country or people from outside the country who are willing to partner with you, willing to work with you, who don't come on day one and tell you, I already have a solution. I want my solution to be tested or to be adopted, but who are willing to work with you in identifying the problem, what exists out there. I think the most important thing is identifying what's wrong out there before suggesting solutions. That doesn't often happen. And that does mean working with people from outside who are willing to work with you, whether outside within the country or outside the country as well.
So Adnan thinks a certain type of mosquito is okay.
So, I mean, a way of making your point is that if being completely immune to outside influence, was good, then North Korea should be like paradise, and Myanmar pre-liberalization should have been paradise. So it's obviously that lots of places don't in fact have a purely intrinsic dynamic that leads to performance either. So yeah, sometimes having the outside actor there as to help, to facilitate, to make clear can be good, and create pressures to look around and say, how am I actually performing on outcomes? But the vectors that come in with solutions rather than helping you identify problems, and that come in kind of with experience that isn't relative to your situation, they're not particularly helpful. And after all the now developed countries developed without any foreign experts. Or not quite true. Meaning, Denmark didn't become Denmark by flying in people from, other places to tell them how to do it. They struggled. They had a long conflictual struggle along a kind of difficult path, as Jim and Frank were talking about, and got those dynamics right. And like the idea, and I think it was, either Frank or Jim, there's like the idea that technocratic interventions from the outside are kind of key to this, I think, is fundamentally wrong.
So is there again, both of you, just following up on these responses, is there a set of things I'm sitting here, we are more or less external actors here. Is there something that converts us from the blood-sucking mosquito to the pollinating bee or whatever the analogy is what are the things we need to do to make sure as external actors that we don't fall prey to what Lant seems to suggest is an inherent incentive problem, which is no matter what we do, it's in our incentive to be the experts, to be the solution first guys, whether it be donor or political incentives. So walk me through how we would change and also why that's an equilibrium.
That doesn't necessarily have to be equilibrium. That's equilibrium that we're trying to shift. There are not too many examples out there of outsider actors working with inside actors in more of a collaborative relationship. So one of the ways of doing that was what I also suggested on the last slide was starting from where you are, respecting the constraint that you have, and not imagining that you are in a different place, yet you are a high capability state when in reality you are not. In other words, like diagnosing the problem, identifying the source of the problem, the source of the inefficiency, before trying to suggest a solution. In my example, in public procurement, no matter whichever government you go to, sometimes even developed country governments, they'll tend to think that we need to have more rules because the frontline agents are corrupt. We can't give them more autonomy, these guys are corrupt. We need to have more rules. We need to give more power to the supervisors, to the monitors, and that's the solution. And one fundamental problem with that is you don't know what the source of the inefficiency is. You don't know whether it's corruption or inefficiency, and if it is corruption, is it more the corruption of the frontline agent or the supervisor? If it is inefficiency, is it corruption more or passive waste or inefficiency that's more the source of the problem? And this is not just true for Pakistan. We have seen the same pattern throughout the world. If you look at Italy, so my colleagues did this work on Italy, what they find is most of the waste in public procurement in Italy, more than 80% of this is caused by passive waste, inefficiencies, rules that create passive waste and inefficiency and not corruption. That's obviously like context specific. In other contexts, it could be very different. It could be corruption. I think the first and most important, the fundamental question is diagnose, identify what the source of the problem is before diagnosing solutions. That maybe also helps identify the mosquitoes from, I don't know, the good bees. Is people, agencies and others who are willing to work, who are willing to do this hard work of identifying what is wrong out there. So when Ricardo goes to a country, he doesn't go on day one and suggest, here is what you should do. So he works there, he identifies the problem, he works with the data, he works on the constraints that exist out there. From the other side, from the side of the government, our domestic policy actors, that's one way of identifying, separating the types, who is willing to work with us, and not just like willing to work with us on identifying a problem, ideally also jointly designing solutions, testing them whether they work or not. And even the best of solutions may not work. So we also need to have a strategy of call it error correction or learning over time, and refining over time. Solutions that we can refine on the basis of data or learning. The challenge is how do we incorporate this within a state, what I call a learning state, and how can outside actors be a force for good in contributing to setting up a learning state and not do something which undermines the key establishment of a
That your solution seems to be just replicate and scale up Ricardo. Who are these external actors? So the question is, what is someone like Ricardo's incentive structure? Sorry, Ricardo, we're putting you on the spot now, but we're going to have you speak on Venezuela soon enough. But what's the incentive for external actors to do what you just said? That requires patience. That requires building this space. And so maybe turn it back to Lant. You were worried about the inherent political economy of this not working because of donors and consultants. Are researchers any different?
I think researchers at least have the freedom to be different because they're under less, part of the difficulty is that, donor agencies, either bilateral or multilateral, are in fact highly honed modern bureaucracies. They do in fact have to comply. So DFID can't say to the British government, oh, by the way, we work in these really difficult environments. We need to be able to spend British money in ways inconsistent with British procurement law. Like, no. Like, you're part of the British government, and the highways spend money, and the Department of Defense spends money. DFID has to be a British bureaucracy, and yet it has to interact in a productive way with other bureaucracies, and that is a real trick academics don't necessarily have to confront. But anybody working at scale in any official capacity, including moving any magnitude of money, has to confront. And then, the difficulty and the challenge is to create, intermediate gears between those two gears. You've got one gear, which is the way formal high modern bureaucracies work, and one gear, which is the way the country works. And too often you try and put those gears in direct touch. It's like, hooking a low voltage device to a super high voltage source. It just burns it out. You need to have resistors. You need to have mechanisms in place so that people on the ground can use their discretion, but at the still time be compatible with bureaucratic things. And it's tricky, but with innovation, with some amount of concern, it can be done. And like the response to your first question, like what do you do? Like I've been in modern hospitals for reasons I don't want to talk about, but they're filled with all these machines giving information. And I was in a hospital where over the patient's bed, there was a sign that says, "Look at the patient." Because of course, what would doctors come in and do? They would come in and they'd look at the machines and walk back out, right? And and so one time working for the World Bank, I ended up going out with these government officials that had been providing these official reports to the World Bank about what was going on. And we got to the field and learned, and we both knew ex ante, but we learned, in a very concrete way that what they'd been telling was a complete fiction. And I turned to them and I said, "Why have you been telling me these reports were reliable? You must have known they weren't." And they said, "Oh, well, you're from the World Bank. You never wanted to know the truth before." And gotcha. We had been very happy with, being a modern bureaucracy and relying on the government lying to us so that we didn't actually have to expose ourselves to
just
reality.
to follow up a bit on that, so there are people from foundations here, so in the Q&A, I'm going to encourage them to challenge Lant's view. Lant likes a fight, and so I want a more personal question for you, Lant, which is, you're heading RISE.
Yes.
RISE, just so you guys know, Lant has amazing work in education. RISE is a DFID-funded OPM, which is a consulting firm, structured effort to improve education in 4 or 5 countries. So you very much, there's a donor there, there's a consulting firm there, there's you, the academic there. How are you preventing this bureaucraties showing up into the work you're doing?
I mean,
I told you it'll be a tough question.
This is slightly a dodge, but the way I'm doing it is by saying again and again, this is a research question. I'm not, in fact, improving education in these countries. I'm learning how education actually works in this country and how it might actually be improved, and that's a research question. Because too often the donors don't understand the difference between research, in which you're actually learning from and about the context, and advocacy, which is you already think you have the solution and you're peddling it. So more than once, they have said, "But what are you actually doing to change policy in this country?" And I have said, "Nothing, because first we have to do the research and make sure we're right."
And how is that working for you?
Not so well, but it's preventing me from giving bad advice. Now let's see if I can turn around and ultimately give good advice.
I want to come back something specific to Adnan, what you said. We can open up in a few minutes. Sort of more into the details of what you said. So this idea of a learning state sounds intriguing. Who doesn't want to be a learning state or a learning person? It seems like everything we should desire. That said, the implementation of what it means to be a learning state worries me a bit. So imagine I'm a politician, and I have to get up, and my slogan is going to be, "I don't know what I should be doing, but I'm going to do my best and learn." That doesn't sound like an exciting slogan for a politician to have. Politicians typically should be believers and missionaries, have already declared success before even starting. So how does that work for you? And that's the head of an organization in some sense. The state is headed by this individual who clearly seems, just because of the sheer sort of psychology of what gets to get elected, is not going to say that statement. So how do we do that?
So not easy. So yes, and it's not just a failure of the political leadership, it's a failure of the political system, the voters, citizens, media. Everyone demands someone who has answers. And the leadership obviously is endogenous to it, it responds to it. And it's very hard to come up with a vision that I want to learn from my mistakes. I want to celebrate my mistakes. And because the media would have you like, you don't know what you're doing. So when I think of my own country, we think of strong leaders who come with strong visions, but those visions don't necessarily have to be visions of what I want to do. I think the path through which you want to do could be open to experimentation, mistakes, and learning. Where you want to get to is a different thing, is a vision that a leadership or a political system could come up with. But I think it's not just about leaders, but it's also about the incentives in the system and other players out there, whether it's media, other players that generate evidence, citizens, media, lobby, pressure groups, could also hold the government accountable for not just for the ultimate vision, but also for the way they are going about implementing a vision. Is there a method to the madness? And that's a very tough challenge. Someone like Matt Andrews and others would work with the government. So governments who are willing to or who are keen to reform would send signals. Those are costly signals. They also have to position themselves differently in within the country. Send signal that they want to, like they are open to mistakes. So one of the fundamental features of my life in the policy world was mistakes are very costly, and the system is designed in a manner as to prevent what Lant would call positive deviance, which is doing anything which is outside the box. I showed you examples like every procurement officer, they would much rather care about like quality of procurement, but however the incentives in the system are all designed in a manner where all they care about is was the paperwork complete or not. And that's something that we could change. Smart, like both the political system and others reformers and others who have foresight could change the incentives in the system, but that's not just one individual, it's the incentives in the ecosystem.
Can I follow up on that? Because
Yes,
I think I don't know why I didn't think of this, but I've been hearing my whole life that the problem is that bureaucracies are risk averse to failure, or bureaucracies don't want to make mistakes. And it's completely, totally false. It's the opposite. Organizations exist to fail. They exist to fail without blame. So the reason they focus on compliance is if you focus on compliance, you can fail at your objective and not have any blame. So in a weird sense, bureaucratic organizations exist to fail. They're not risk averse to failure. They embrace failure. They're completely immune to failure. What they do is diffuse blame. Yeah. And so partly what you would have to do as a politician is to say, damn it, we've been risk averse. We haven't been risk averse to failure. We've been failing and not admitting it. I'm going to make blame fall on people who fail, not blame fall on people who don't comply with rules and processes that aren't producing the outcomes we need. So I remember I was in India. I was talking about different ways of having the parents engaged in schooling via their locally elected representatives in India with my colleagues from the education department of the bank, and they're going, oh, no, that's way too risky. We'd just done a study showing that 11% of fifth graders could read a sentence. Like, what's the risk? It's going to fall to 10? Like, you're not risking failure. You are failing, right? It's not risky, but they had defined risk as compliance, blame. So they were like, no, if we do something new, then we could get blamed.
Adnan, do you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
So, Lant, to you, one last question, and then I think we should really turn it to the audience so we can keep going this way otherwise. Your advice sounds a bit like millennial parenting.
Okay.
Which is don't stress. This organization isn't ready as yet. This country isn't ready as yet. Let's be gentle. Let's let them work it out. You keep saying sort of, if you stress an organization beyond its capacity, it fails. But surely we have biological evidence of this. We have psychological evidence of this. We have macro evidence, which is stress produces, improvements. You stress a system to get the system to push itself to move. So you can't be saying no stress. But the question is, if it's not no stress, then what is the right level of stress? Why is it that asking, if I think of my sort of personal anecdote experience, I wasn't sitting in Pakistan or Nigeria being told, hey, just be slightly better. No, I wanted to come to MIT. I wanted to beat the Singaporean kid or the Chinese kid or the American kid. I want to be that kid. So if you tell me, no, it's okay for you to just do a bit of stuff, you're demotivating me. So how does that work out?
It works exactly like you say, which is if you go and you say, by the way, let's actually work on improving the level of performance from where you are, they'll say, oh, you want us to lower our ambition. And it's like, no, I want you to stop this idiotic wishful thinking and actually have ambition on a reasonable trajectory. I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, I want to plan for economic growth so that I'm going to grow at 12% a year for the next 20 years, I don't say, oh, that's an ambitious plan. Let me reward your ambition. No, that's just stupid. Not going to happen. Shoot for 6 and maybe we can get there. But 6 is ambitious, 12 is just stupid, right? And the world's just full of just stupid. I mean, if you look at what countries have been doing with respect to fragile states, they're going to say, oh, we'll have a, the US government said, we're going to leave Afghanistan in 5 years when it has a strong, capable state. It's like, that's stupid. Like, Afghanistan's going to have a strong, capable state, maybe, good luck, super, everything goes right, 30 years. So again, but again, you're exactly right, that they say, oh, you're trying to lower ambition.
So do you want to distinguish between aspirations
versus
expectations? So you can imagine a situation where you aspire to be unbelievable. We all aspire to be a Nobel laureate. But
I'm 60. By the way, I'm 60. I've given up on that.
You can still aspire, lad.
At your age, no. At your age, you can aspire. At my age, you have to like.
But do you want to? I guess what I'm trying to distinguish is the. So the reason I say this is there is evidence in psychology that aspiring, hoping is really powerful.
And what we, in PDA and Matt will talk about is like we want to empower good struggles. But we want to acknowledge it's a struggle, it's going to be conflictual, it's going to involve pushback. What we don't want to do is empower kind of castles in the sky, right? But we want stress for performance, but we want stress for performance. And to get stress for performance, you have to start from where you are, and you have to have, and Matt's going to talk about this, so I know you have to have a locally nominated problem that you're willing to stress yourself about. But if the donors come in and say, I want you to stress about this, it's like, no, that's not very helpful. And if the donors come in and say, if you come to me and say, Lant, I really want to improve your athleticism, I want you to fly around the room. Well, no, you've actually just released me from any stress. No matter what I do, I'm not going to be able to fly around the room. So in a weird way, overambitious goals release stress. They don't create stress. It's like, do some exercises to fly around the room. Okay, come back in 6 months, I'll tell you I did them. And if your performance test is, can I fly around the room? I know I'm going to fail, so what the hell? So I think, we're all about stress and performance, but it's got to be, on a trajectory you can accomplish and around a problem you're willing to stress about. Whereas, anyway.
Excellent.
The only thing I will add to that is I think the central question in growth and development is not where we want to get to. We all want to get to become Denmark. I think the central question that we have is how do we get from where we are today to where we want to go? That's a key question. So it's not the aspiration, it's not the end goal. Yes, we want to be at MIT. What works for you may not work for someone else. And that passage, that path, that transition path is the most important and most difficult question.
Great. Let's open up. So the rules, just very quickly on the rules. I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. My request is keep the questions as questions, not comments. I have a tendency of cutting people short because I'm trying to maximize diversity of questions. So with that, let's just start. Please, lady first.
In Singapore
wait for the microphone, please.
Washington, D.C. In Singapore and Denmark, my impression is that public employees are well paid. In Venezuela, they're not well paid. We know that. So what is the chicken and egg problem here in terms of what you expect of a public employee? Private enterprises generally pay reasonably well their employees and they can lose their jobs. What happens in the public sector?
Awesome. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Rami Ahmed from Islamic Development Bank. Actually, it's often very painful to get in discussions with heads of organizations or officials in rich countries, like the Gulf region, for example. And you hear them talking about how they use this consultant or that consultant. Some high officials actually enjoy seeing the McKinseys and the BCGs of the world, competing for a piece of work here or there.
Yeah, but I didn't name them.
I'm just giving examples.
For example.
But again, the counter argument comes, look at UAE. And you, I think, had it in the introduction of the report of your book, saying that United Arab Emirates is one of the top 4 countries in capabilities, but yet you see how people are relying on outside actors. So the question is, what are your thoughts on really trying to get people to understand the sustainable part of building capabilities of a state or an organization where resources are available for a quick hit or a quick, basically a shortcut by getting some blue-eyed, blonde guy to come in and sit next to a director, not even a minister, next to a director in directorate. Thank you.
There's a question right there.
I guess I'd like to relate this partly to Suman Berry from India, to yesterday's discussion, but go beyond that. So I guess the whole hope when we believed in convergence was that there was a possibility of leapfrogging. And is your message that in this area there is no leapfrogging? Because that was partly, I guess, what Jim was saying yesterday. Secondly, so that it's not so pessimistic, how do you account for some of the pockets of fairly generalized achievement across developing countries? How do you account for an Ethiopian Airlines, for example? What does that represent? Because often these things are in the state sector. Are those useful, as it were, test beds to see exactly where you can apply the stress and indeed leapfrog?
Thank you.
And the link to yesterday was just the question of, vowels and consonants. Are you basically saying you can't leapfrog with the vowels?
Great, thank you. Okay, whichever order you guys want to take them in.
I can start off with the pay question and maybe the last question. So it's not about pay. So there's enough example of teachers and other public servants and bureaucrats being paid far more than private sector equivalents. Teachers paid 5 times more than private sector teachers in India, Pakistan, many other contexts, and not performing as well. Because the incentive structures in the system are such that they don't show up and they don't have any incentive to perform. So it's about incentives, it's about, call it broadly also the organizational culture. And that also relates to the last question. So within the same public sector, you do have, or within different countries, you do have organizations that perform very well, and other organizations that don't perform. And sometimes within the same public sector also, you go to Bangladesh, you go to many places in Africa, you have an NGO, members who are members of the NGO who are very charged, very mission-driven, motivated, whether belonging to BRAC or some other organization. In the same village, you have exactly similar type of people working for the state who don't show up to their job. Teachers, doctors not showing up to their job, or when they show up, not doing what is expected of them. So it's a lot about like both the individual motivation and incentive, but a lot more about the organizational culture. And the fundamental question is, how do you change organizational culture? How do you change the culture of an organization from a dysfunctional, call it an organizational culture, to one that is mission-driven and that performs? And we do have islands of excellence. You mentioned Ethiopia Airlines. I travel around the world quite a lot. I see many other islands in places like Rwanda, even places like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Zambia, Malawi, Asia, other contexts. The one question is, why do they exist? So in a sea of, in a widespread ocean of dysfunctionality. So whether it's particular constellation of circumstances, happenstance, random circumstances, leadership, but there are many reasons as to why they exist. But can they sustain over time is one question, but also can we diffuse from one particular set of organizations, call it a positive sense of diffusion, to other organizations within the public sector? That's $1 million question. That doesn't happen without there being the incentives in the ecosystem or the wider political system being supportive to that type of change. And in response to your last question, yes, I do believe that leapfrogging from where we are is not a desirable strategy to adopt, but because that leads us often to an unrealistic, ambitious expectation that doesn't lead us to deal with the reality, with the existing conditions, to deal with where we are. But once we deal with the process of understanding the sources of inefficiencies, building a learning state, building on where we are, leapfrogging ex post could be possible. So many countries, Ethiopia, Singapore, Rwandas of the world have demonstrated that to some extent.
Just a quick thing before Lant jumps in. On the people question, on the pay question, there's often the sense in poor countries in particular that our problem is the problem in Pakistan, the problem in Zimbabwe, or the problem in Venezuela is the people, right? This kind of wish list that you suddenly supplant your people, particularly in the government, with a new set of people. That's just silly. That's unrealistic. The work that Adnan have been doing now for about 10 years with one set of people. So one of the most maligned people in any country are tax collectors, not surprisingly. So we've been doing these projects with tax collectors, with the government of Pakistan, the tax department, where with the same tax collectors, which people said were super corrupt, will never do anything, are just the worst things possible, no one wants to marry into their families, that kind of stuff. These same guys, when you give them either performance incentives or non-pecuniary incentives, give them rewards for being placed in better locations if they perform well, we find massive improvements in tax collection, no change in personnel. Right, so this idea, I think it's very important for us to say that within the same set of things, it's not that what we're talking about is kind of incremental change and small things happening. You can actually make fairly small tweaks in kind of these incentive structures and get pretty large movements with the same set of people that you have. And I think, I'm not saying we shouldn't necessarily improve the human capital of people, of course we should, but there's a lot of margins of improvement even within that. Lant?
So I think maybe the most important thing we should have learned from the last 40 years of development experience was that the kind of solo model of convergence was completely, totally wrong. And the way in which it was wrong is in the convergence thinking, we had this term called A, which was the productivity of the economy that multiplied times the stuff that you had, the machines and the human capital. And the reason we anticipated convergence is that A, we thought of as A as this know that, disembodied blueprints, and that knowledge would converge instantaneously, and since the A converged instantaneously, the marginal product of capital would be very high because you had high A and low K, and therefore you would get people accumulating and investing in those countries to get the K over L up to the level of the A. Everything about that was wrong, because what has happened in the world over the last 40 years is we've had convergence in everything but A.
Yeah.
It's A, the TFP, the measured productivity, that hasn't converged, even though human capital's converged, measured capital stocks have converged. So in a weird way, the Solow model said super rapid convergence of A, this disembodied knowledge, slow convergence of factors. Exactly the opposite, continued divergence of A, which is why Ricardo has come up with whole new ways of thinking about A. If you think of what A is in a Scrabble model, it's not disembodied. And then the second thing is, you think of like a 2x2, because you're at the Kennedy School and we all think of 2x2s naturally. And we've been thinking about knowledge in fundamentally the wrong way. Knowledge, we think of knowledge that. Knowledge that Lant Pritchett is 5'9", right? That's a knowledge that, it's a propositional knowledge. And then there's a how-to knowledge, and that's of people. And then there's the same of organizations. Like, what do the people in the organizations know that? But the real constraint is know-how of organizations, and that's the part we haven't gotten right. That's the big stuck, that's what we're trying to fix with the learning state in PDAA, is we have to have a radically different model of catch-up of the know-how embodied in large complex organizations. And that's kind of fundamental to the way CID and Growth Lab and PDIA and EPOD have been working. And so we shouldn't expect this rapid leapfrogging. The rapid leapfrogging can happen in know that, right? With the internet, know that diffuses instantaneously, right? But we thought know that was the constraint. No, that's not the constraint. Know how, embodied in large complex organizations that can combine the many, many letters it takes for a modern economy, that's the key both in the public and the private sector.
I mean, it's a really nice example of what
pay doesn't matter, but she's gone. Pay doesn't matter.
There's a really nice example of what Lant said. There's a superb case on Daewoo in Bangladesh. So the Bangladesh textile industry booms massively. And the question is, why did it boom? And one example is Daewoo came and set up actually a unit in Dhaka. And what happens is 10 years later, the unit closes down. There's a bad deal with a local provider, kind of the usual stuff. But most of the guys who worked in the Daewoo unit set up their own entrepreneurial units. And the question is, well, why was that happening? If you could download blueprints on how to make zippers and Gore-Tex jackets, why do you need Daewoo to come in and teach you some stuff? So I'd encourage you guys to, it's I think John Woorie or something. There's a really nice case study on this. So there's a lot of example of what Lant just said. Lant, the consultant question.
The Gulf question, so Danny Roderick has this just super pregnant result that if you look at how, I'm saying that's a metaphor, right? It's like, it can...
Hopefully it will become clear what you meant by that.
No, in the sense that the result in itself seems very trivial, but I think it's full of insight if you explore it, right? And it produces things like, anyway, but it was that if you look at the transition of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the depth and length of the recession that they had after the transition was non-linear related to the distance from Berlin. So if you were super close to Berlin, Poland, Hungary, you had a shallow and short recession. If you were an intermediate distance for Berlin, you were destroyed completely. The Georgias of the world just fell into a very deep, very long recession. And if you were far from Berlin, you did okay. And it's like, that's a really interesting empirical finding. And I think the answer is, if you were close enough to actually get to Europe, bringing in the European consultants helped you, because it created stress of things you could do. So maybe the Gulf bringing in McKinsey, actually, the Gulf is close enough that they're talking about relevant knowledge. But if you were far enough from Berlin that being Europe wasn't really an option, the attempt to be Europe destroyed you. It didn't help. And then if you were far enough from Europe, you were the Stans. You were like, to hell with them, I'm going to continue being a dictator and do business in the old ways we did business. They actually did okay, because they didn't disrupt it in favor of trying to do something they couldn't do. So I think this just comes back to the point that, you know, you want to be ambitious, but you want to be ambitious from where you are. And it just didn't do the intermediate countries any good to pretend to be more ambitious than they were. So I mean,
one thing to add to that.
So I don't know enough about the Gulf. Maybe you are close enough that you can like bring these guys in, and after all, business consultants have a role. They make money because if they transmit knowledge of organizational know-how from one that has it to one that almost has it, that actually works, right? McKinsey running around America, they probably aren't complete frauds, right?
You should tweet that. That's the best compliment I've ever given anyone.
That's probably the nicest thing I've ever said about them.
For anyone.
Probably not complete frauds. Because they're actually transmitting across similarly situated organizations, and they're trying to get you to catch up from something you can't catch up to. But it's this model in the middle and the overambitious rules. Literally, the story's probably apocryphal, but I'm going to tell it anyway. The law that was passed by the Afghan legislator to set up an insurance industry in Afghanistan had the 8th District Court of Appeals in the US as the appellate court for disputes about insurance because they forgot to search and replace. They had literally so completely copied the US law that they forgot to search and replace and take out Philadelphia as the appellate
Let's open up
court
again
for disputes.
One last point. So I've done a lot of, just on the Middle East thing, I've done a lot of work in the Middle East. I'm always fascinated by the extent of consultants sitting in line ministries in the government. My concern is similar to Lant. It's not as much how far you are. That's, I think, an important criteria as well. It's also, think of sort of infant industry protection in East Asia versus Africa. It's what you say to your individuals about what the future is. So if you say in Africa, look, we can continue infant industry protection forever, you set up really wrong expectations of acquiring human capital of your own. If you're East Asia and you can credibly say in 10 or 15 years, we will shut this protection down, you better be ready. The question for me in the Middle East is not are the consultants sitting in your offices, but what are you telling the local individuals? Are you saying 4 years more of this stuff and then it's going to end, you better learn from these guys and get your act together? Or are you saying, yeah, we can keep buying these guys? Very similar things, very different expectations, and I think that's the critical part. I hear a lot more of the former, unfortunately, than the latter. Hopefully, as oil collapses more, we'll get more of the latter.
One of our mottos in PDAA work is give the work back.
Absolutely.
We never do the work, because if you do the work, you're not building capability.
Let me take, hopefully, 3 more questions. Please go ahead.
Hi, Arturo Brillenburg. Since we're talking about a learning model, have you guys studied people who actually learn? That is, the private sector or the good airlines or whatever. Because what you're talking about, it seems to be.
I thought you meant kids, but okay.
Okay.
No, I
Yes,
meant
learners.
Kind of an aggressive posing of the question, isn't it? No, we never thought of that.
Okay. Given that, no. Now you've completely distracted me.
That was my intent. Anyway,
Please,
sorry.
finish.
The fact that the private sector learns, you said the textile firms learn. So it's not, what you're telling me is that knowledge, the know-how, is truly local. I mean, local. The next firm across might not have it, this firm does. Or this government agency has it, this doesn't. So there's got to be a transmission mechanism you guys have studied. I would love to hear about that.
Awesome question. Great, thank you. Please go ahead.
Boya J. Farah, writer from Somalia. I went back to Somalia in August to try to improve the education there. And what I saw is if you really want to build something, for example, in Somalia now, you look up to Turkey and China. If you want to see a real infrastructure, if you want to see a photo app, a big budget just in words, you look at Europe and America. They really don't build like real tangible infrastructure there. So do you think we should learn something from China and Turks?
Great. Let me just take, there was a question, Arvind, and I'll come back to you. Please go ahead, Arvind.
Arvind's gonna
Thanks.
wait for the mic here, because
It's nice to quarrel with Lant, as you said, right? So observation number one, if you look around this room, not one person from the most successful post-war countries, China, Korea, Taiwan, whatever, right? Singapore, nobody here. So that's just a kind of spurious correlation, but I want to build on that.
There's a question coming, right,
There's a question
Arvind?
coming, yeah.
is that observation one?
So Lant, do you think that the vector problem is actually intrinsic to the way kind of knowledge is created and curated by the North Atlantic seaboard? And therefore, really what you need, because I think you're a bit too soft on yourself, whatever, PDIA, rice, et cetera, I think you're being too soft on yourself. Maybe that has all the same problems that, you are railing against. And therefore, the only really long-term solution is, knowledge creation should be much more diverse and spread out. And that's the only way you kind of address this kind of deeper problem of.
Great, thank you. Please.
Thank you. Juan Carlos Zapata from the Foundation for the Development of Guatemala. Just one question on your intake of labor unions in public officials, specifically in countries in Latin America. We have a lot of examples of labor unions where procurement laws, and specifically labor laws, undermine the capacity of the governments versus the ministers, what a minister wants to do, but then he has to go through a wall with the labor union. So what are your thoughts about that? Thank you.
Let me take a last question. I think this will be if someone is really desperate to ask a question, it's just burning inside and hasn't been asked, go ahead. It's always like an intimidating preface. That's fine. I'll give it a few seconds because we're just going to do this last round of responses and I think we'll go into the break. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I have to go teach a class in 3 minutes. So, on your question of the transmission mechanism, very important question. So, when that happens in certain places, there is transmission of knowledge. There is what we will call like a positive contagion. We want more of that to happen. So, in the private sector, Asim gave the example of Bangladesh. So, it was Desh garment, the first factory opened up by Daewoo in 1978 in a country where they had no tradition of garments. The factory closed down. but the knowledge accumulated of how do you make garments and how do you export garments. And today we have a $34 billion industry, one of the largest in the world. That's a very positive example of positive contagion. That doesn't often happen in other countries, even within the private sector, but far more importantly within the public sector. I showed you the example of that dispersion of prices of printing paper. So I have the similar graph from other contexts, Italy, many other countries. We see the same dispersion. People pay within public sector, facing the same constraints, the same environment, people pay very different prices for exactly the same good. So there is something to be said about whether it's individual motivation or it is about like different public bodies are doing something systematically different. Can we learn from them and can we diffuse them? I think the constraints are far greater in the public sector, but there are, I think what I'm emphasizing is creating a learning ecosystem where we can learn from successes, but also from failures and help diffuse those in the environment. I think
there was Turkey. You want to respond? You can leave early.
Yeah.
So there's Turkey and China. There's a vector problem that's more for Lant, and there's labor unions.
Yeah, labor unions. I'm not aware of the in the procurement sector, like example that I'm giving. I think most of the inefficiencies come from the way the public sector, the rules of the game are set up. So the rules of the game are set up in a way which are copied, basically cut and paste from other contexts. As I mentioned, if you look into the procurement manual, they all look very, very similar. And sometimes they are like, they still have that language of Philadelphia or others, and because they are literally cut and paste. And I think the fundamental challenge there is they don't respect where we are starting from, what the reality is of the context that we are. And some of those constraints could be coming from the labor unions. But that fundamental question remains, start from where you are, learn, understand the sources of inefficiency in your particular context and build from there. But also learn from your mistakes and refine.
So Dan, we have a few more minutes, but I'll let you go because I don't want to prevent learning of our future leaders. So,
Okay.
thank you so much, Adnan. Teaching.
Thank you.
You're left to handle the remaining questions.
So first question is we've obviously looked at both how successful organizations in the public and private sector learn. Several things though. One, if you look at the private sector, you realize learning for an organization is not easy. Like big, well-managed, high-powered firms go bankrupt all the time. And like, why do organizations go bankrupt if they could learn and respond to the new circumstances? But one thing we learned from the private sector is an organization changing its know-how is hard for any organization.
Hence creative destruction, the whole.
Yeah, creative destruction.
That's the entire.
It involves destruction, right? I mean, for some reason, Sears invented Amazon. Like, the catalog, we'll ship it to you, just order it. Like, all of the elements of Amazon were in Sears 50 years ago, and Sears is bankrupt and Amazon's worth $1 gazillion billion, right? Or something like that. Or, yeah. The spouse of the owner of Amazon is worth $1 gazillion billion. That's how many $1 billion are worth. So anyway, so we don't learn a lot from that. But by the same token, what Ricardo said last night, here's how the private sector acquires letters. The public sector is disadvantaged relative to the private sector in how they can acquire letters in every way, which is why we're trying to develop public sector specific modalities of organizational learning that take into account the differential circumstances of the public sector. And I think the fetishization of the private sector, that the public sector should try and imitate the private sector in every respect, just isn't realistic and isn't very helpful. They have to acknowledge the fundamental constraints of being the public sector. I think this is a very deep point, which is you should learn from people that still have relevant experience to what you're trying to do. So the town I grew up in the United States just happened to have two large construction firms who built dams and they had just been building a whole bunch of large-scale dams in the 1950s and 1930s to 1950s in the United States. So if you wanted somebody who knew how to build dams, you went out and found people who knew how to build dams, and they were in the United States. The U.S. hasn't built a big dam in 50 years. Like, if you want to know how to build a dam, don't come to the United States, come to China, right? So I think there is a certain extent to which you have to start looking at people who have the knowledge you want that's close enough to what you need. And I think in a lot of respects, what people in rich countries now know just is like less than helpful to what countries far behind need to know. So I think there is a lot of that. It's just like, you know, the people running public sector organizations in the United States don't know jack all about how to create a public sector organization. They're managers, they're taxi drivers, not designers of internal combustion engine. And a lot of what development consists of is shipping taxi drivers to countries to tell them how to design a combustion engine. The people who run successful organizations in the West know less about how to create an organization than the man on the street, because they have a completely misleading notion, because they inherited a successful organization already. Labor unions, it's too long and too complex, but we have many aphorisms in PDIA, and one is you can't beat a turtle to move. So if your theory of change is, I'm going to pick up a stick and beat a turtle and get it to walk where I want it to go, you should just give up, because turtles exist as a species because they're resistant to being beaten. You know, public sector organizations, like you try and go head to head against public sector labor unions in Latin America, you will get tired of beating them well before they move, because they have hard external shell to resistance. So, and then the last thing is, I think again, you're making a very deep point, but I'm always too soft on myself, because I know what a nice guy I am. So, I want to be soft on myself. But I think we really need to, you know, be more cautious about the way we use the word knowledge, because when you talk about knowledge curation, academics want to privilege individual knowledge of that. I know that, and I know it, and I'm an expert because I know it. Whereas the knowledge we're trying to create with PDIA is organizational knowledge of how to, which can't be curated. It just can't be curated. It has to be created. We have a slogan, and again, we have many aphorisms because we've been doing it. You can't juggle without the struggle. Like, if you're an organization and you want to juggle, you have to pick up some balls and throw them around and drop them and learn how to do it. And we can't transmit the organizational know-how in a curated way. So all this attempt to create knowledge banks and knowledge this and knowledge that is just fundamental wrong. I mean, we need different words for these 4 boxes of the knowledge matrix. You know, if we keep treating knowledge like it's a know that, that I know that, and it's individuated, that's not the problem. That one thing we have learned for sure is that's not the reason why some firms are less productive and some organizations are less productive. You know, it's organizational embodied know-how, and that can't be curated in the Northern Atlantic way. And I think you're exactly right about that. How much PDIA we've actually freed ourselves from that, maybe we're overestimating it, but we really say we don't come with any knowledge to organizations. We come with a set of tools that allow them to acquire the organizational know-how to do what they want to do. And so maybe we have some meta-knowledge about how to acquire knowledge, how to, but we don't have any, but we give it away for free, so we're not trying to monopolize it.
So I want to bring the session to a close. Both Lant and Adnan, after he gets done teaching, is going to be back as well, so they'll be around. You should grab a hold of them if you have further questions. You know, despite the fact that we title the session as The Big Stuck, you know, I sort of leave this session with a fairly optimistic view. And I think the optimistic view is there's always a fear of, and I've seen this a lot when I work with countries as well, which is we're so far from what we could be. Oh, that best practice is so hard to do. I don't think that's a message I'm hearing from my colleagues and my own experience. In fact, the message is very empowering in some sense. It's a bit frightening, but it's empowering, which is the responsibility really lies with you in the country, with you, the actor. It's not a responsibility you can shed on someone else. And it's also not an excuse to say, I can't do this because it's too difficult. Just like we tell a child when we start teaching a child a language, it's okay to speak. It's okay to speak in whatever way you can speak. But at least try and speak, try and improve from where you are. And I think that's a very empowering message. And I think the word of caution over here, which kind of Arvind alludes to as well, the word of caution is when you're getting that child to speak, when you're getting someone who doesn't have the quite resources, and I don't want to sound sort of hierarchical by saying, well, poor countries are children and we're the adults, but in terms of resources, when you have someone who's struggling, trying to experiment, there's a real question, as any good parent would have, is what is your role in that? How much do you support that process? Are you self-aware of the fact that you can suffocate, you can shove your own views on that organization, on that country, on that individual? How do you get them the space to be able to be who they are, while at the same time being supportive? And that's just as hard it is as a parent to have that balance. I think it's just as hard on us to be very self-aware of that. Also be very self-aware of the power we wield when we come in as experts. And I think that's a note of caution that a lot of us are aware of. I know it sounds ironic sitting here at Harvard saying these things, but I honestly think if we're not saying these things here, then where else would we say them? We should obviously say them in country as well, but that's a message I think we want to convey as much as we can. So I wanted to thank everyone for the session today. It's been super fun for me. I hope it was enjoyable for you guys as well.